Hello, second graders. This week we are celebrating President's Day. So, in honor of that, we are going to learn about two different presidents that we have had in the United States of America. So, let me share my screen and we are going to pull up a Scholastic News. This one is called George's Hard Winter. So, we are going to be learning about George Washington.
George's Hard Winter. Before George Washington was our first president, he was in charge of the American Army. He had to keep his soldiers alive during a long, hard winter. Winter in Valley Forge. George Washington kept the American Army together during one hard winter. Long ago, America was ruled by England. In 1775, the Americans started a war to be free. The war was called the Revolutionary War. The Americans needed someone to lead the army in this war. They picked George Washington. George was smart and brave, and he knew a lot about fighting battles. Valley Forge. For 2 years, George and his army fought in many battles. The soldiers were getting tired from the long war. In December of 1777, George and about 10,000 soldiers got to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. George decided that the army would spend the winter there. The worst winter. That winter was horrible. It snowed and snowed. The soldiers had no homes. They built small huts out of logs, but the cold wind blew inside. They slept on the frozen, hard ground. There was never enough food. The soldiers were so hungry. Sometimes they didn't eat for days. Other times, they mixed flour and water together and cooked it over a fire. They called this a fire cake. It tasted terrible, but it helped fill their bellies. The soldiers were freezing cold. They didn't have enough blankets. They shivered in their ripped, ragged uniforms. Some soldiers had worn out their shoes. They had to go barefoot or wrap their feet in rags. As they walked, their aching feet left bloody footprints in the snow. Many men were sick or hurt. About 2,000 men died. George's fight. The soldiers were miserable, and so was George. He stayed with them all winter, and he saw how sick they were. He worked hard to help them. He wrote letter after letter to other American leaders, begging them to send supplies. They said they had nothing to send, but George kept writing anyway. George was worried, but he stayed calm in front of his soldiers. He knew he had to be strong for them through the horrible winter. Help came in spring. Spring finally came, and things started to get better for George and his army. At last, they got more supplies. They also learned that they were getting some help in the war. The army of France, a whole other country, had decided to fight with them against the English. George and his army had survived a long, hard winter. They stayed strong and kept fighting. A few years later, they won the war, and the United States became a free country. By Blair Rainsford.
Okay, we are going to look at this George Washington timeline. So read the timeline of George's life, then answer the questions. Okay, let's read our timeline first. So in 1732, George was born. 1752, George joined the army. 1775, the Revolutionary War began. 1777, the Army got to Valley Forge. 1778, the Army left Valley Forge. 1783, George and his army won the war. 1789, George became our first president. And 1799, George died. So let's look at the questions and see what we can answer. Question number 1, in which year was George born? Is it 1723, 1732, or 1783? Go ahead and look at that timeline. If you said 1732, that is correct. We can look at our timeline and it says 1732, George was born. Let's look at question number 2. What happened in 1783? George joined the army, the Revolutionary War began, or George's army won the war? What happened in 1783? Go ahead and look at that timeline. If we look at our timeline and go to 1783, right here, it says George and his army won the war. So George's army won the war. Let's look at number 3. Which of these happened first? The Revolutionary War began, or the army got to Valley Forge? Okay, let's look at our timeline and find those 2 events on the timeline. Which of these happened first? We look over here. We look over here in 1775, the Revolutionary War began, and in 1777, the army got to Valley Forge. So we know that the Revolutionary War beginning happened first. Question number 4, which of these happened first? George became president or George joined the army? Go ahead and look at the timeline. So in 1752, George joined the army. And in 1789, George became our first president. So George joining the army happened first. Okay. I'm going to exit full screen here, and we are going to move on to another president. So we were just learning about George Washington. Now we are going to learn about Abraham Lincoln. So we are first going to watch a video about Abraham Lincoln.
The life of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809. When Abe was a boy, he and his family lived in a cabin. It was made of logs and had a dirt floor. It had only one room and one window. Abe had to help his family out with a lot of chores. He wasn't able to go to school very often, but he loved to read. There were no electric lights in Abe's cabin, so at night he read by candlelight. One of his favorite books was about George Washington. Abe was a great speaker, too. He loved to talk, and people loved to listen to him. They would come from far away to hear him tell stories. Abe grew up and became a lawyer. He met a woman named Mary Todd. They got married. In 1860, Abe ran for president. He won. Soon after Abe became president, the Civil War started. Some states had left the United States to start their own country. Abe didn't want the country to split apart. He worked hard to bring the states back together. The fighting went on for 4 years. It was a long, hard war. In the end, all the states came back together. Abe had helped keep the country from breaking apart. Abe was a strong and fair president. He kept our country together during a difficult time. Today, many people think he was one of the best presidents our country has ever had.
All right, let's go ahead and look at our Scholastic News all about Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln's beard. Can you imagine Abe Lincoln without a beard? Believe it or not, he didn't always have one. The president's whiskers. Abe Lincoln didn't have a beard until a girl named Grace wrote him a letter about it. The beard changed his life forever. As you read, think about why Grace's letter was important. It was October of 1860. A man named Abraham Lincoln was running to become president. He was tall and thin. He had thick black hair, but he did not have a beard. There were no TVs or internet back in 1860, but his picture was in newspapers and on posters. People knew what Abe looked like, and they wanted to tell him what they thought about it. Grace writes to Abe. In New York, a little girl named Grace Bedell saw a picture of Abe. Grace liked Abe, but she thought his face looked really thin. She thought he would look better with a beard. She decided to write him a letter to let him know how she felt. She told Abe that he should grow whiskers. Back then, that's what people called beards. She said whiskers would make him look handsome and would make more people want to vote for him. Abe writes to Grace. A few days later, Grace got a big surprise. Abe wrote a letter back to her. He said that he wasn't sure about the whiskers. He thought people might think he looked silly with a beard. Soon after that, though, Abe stopped shaving his face. He grew a thick black beard. And soon after that, he won the election. He was going to be the president. Abe meets Grace. A few months later, Abe was headed to the White House, where the president lives. He took a train to get there. Abe's train stopped in Grace's town. A huge crowd had come to see him. Abe told the crowd about Grace and her letter. He asked to meet her. Grace made her way through the crowd. Abe told her, "You see, I let these whiskers grow for you, Grace." He shook her hand and they said goodbye. These days, it's hard to imagine Abe without a beard. But he might never have grown one if it weren't for Grace's letter. Grace proved that everyone's voice is important, even a kid's. Do you have an idea you want to share? Tell people about it. You just might help change the world. By Blair Rainsford. Abe meets Grace in New York. Beard or no beard? Here's how Abe looked before and after he grew the beard. What do you think? Was Grace right?
What do you think? Do you think he's better with the beard or without? Look for Abe. You can find Abe's face around the country and in your pocket. Read the chart to learn about 3 places you can see Abe. So we have been learning about money recently. So this should be familiar to us. We have a penny here. Abe is on the penny. People think the penny is made of just copper, but it's mostly made of a metal called zinc. Abe is also on the $5 bill. A $5 bill lasts about 5.5 years before it gets too worn out to use. Lincoln Memorial. You can see a statue of Abe at the Lincoln Memorial. It is in Washington, D.C., near the White House. So let's answer these questions. Question number 1. About how long does a $5 bill last? Our options are 3 years, 5.5 years, or forever. So go ahead and think about that for a second. Look back up at this table here. If you said 5.5 years, that is correct. Question number 2, which one shows Abe's whole body? Lincoln Memorial, the $5 bill, or the penny? The Lincoln Memorial shows Abe's whole body. Number 3, which one is made mostly of zinc? The Lincoln Memorial, a penny, or a $5 bill? The penny is mostly made of zinc. Question number 4, which one is near the Lincoln Memorial? The White House, Abe's log cabin, or Grace's house? Which one is near the Lincoln Memorial? If you said the White House, that is correct. The Lincoln Memorial is in Washington, D.C., near the White House. All right, I'm gonna exit full screen here, and we're going to go back here to do a little game. And this is called Lincoln's Train is Coming. So we need to answer these questions. In Abe Lincoln's time, there were no TVs or newspapers. What do we think? In Abe Lincoln's time, there were no TVs or newspapers. Think about it for a second. Okay, in Abe Lincoln's time, there were no TVs. How did Grace tell Abe what she thought about his beard? Did she write a letter or did she send him an email? How did Grace tell Abe what she thought about his beard? She wrote a letter. In Abe's time, beards were called whiskers or fur. What were beards called in Abe's time? Whiskers or fur? The answer is whiskers. After reading Grace's letter, Abe grew a thick beard or did not grow a beard. What do we think? What happened after Abe read Grace's letter? He grew a thick beard. Abe won something to become president. So did he win an election or did he win a writing contest? What did Abe win to become president? He won an election. Abe stopped at Grace's town on his way to the White House or his childhood home. Where did Abe stopped at Grace's town on his way to where? The White House or his childhood home? The White House. Abe took something to get to the White House. Did he take an airplane or a train? I think this gives us a pretty good clue. Abe took a train to get to the White House.
Happy President's Day.